Welcome to the program. We've been talking a lot in recent episodes about artificial intelligence. It is such an important and emerging and still poorly understood topic. I think it's important that we continue our journey of discovery around this. And we've been talking to experts in the field. We've been talking to corporate leaders, small business owners who are trying to apply the technology. But I thought it was time for us to take a step back from all the participants who are actively trying to make money off of this and talk to somebody who's covering it, a journalist, a storyteller. And that's who's joining us on this episode today. And I am privileged to be joined by Sharon Goldman, the senior editor at VentureBeat, an online news site that focuses on helping leaders in the sector, venture capital, make intelligent decisions around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data. She has been a journalist for 2.5 decades, devoting the last 12 of those years to examining the impact of artificial intelligence and technological developments related to it on the business community. She has contributed and written to Forbes.com, Business Insider, and Deloitte, alongside many others, being at the forefront of the introduction of AI tools such as ChatGPT. Now, in this particular episode, we are going to cover a lot of ground, but we are going to take it from an angle of regulation, where the European Union and the US have some different views on AI, and the EU is much further along in the maturity curve of developing some rules of the road for companies exploring AI. We're going to talk about some of the issues that policymakers have to wrestle with and respond to, as well as how corporations, for profits and non for profits, as well as policymakers, are trying to balance the risk and the potential innovation and rewards that come with exploring this field. It's rare that we get an opportunity to spend an hour with somebody as intelligent on a topic as Sharon is, so we're very grateful that she took the time to speak with me. And in fact, we went just a little more than the hour, but as we get into the topics, as we get into the conversation, I think you will agree with me that it was well worth it. And I am very excited to present this interview to you in its totality. And I invite you to share this far and wide as you go through and listen to today's program. So, without any further delay, here is my interview with VentureBeat senior editor, Sharon Goldman. Sharon Goldman, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Brian. Great to be here.
All right, so let's kick off so that we level set everybody on the terminology around artificial intelligence, because we're going to spend so much time today talking about it. What is your definition of artificial intelligence? And maybe the add-on to that would be generative AI. We're hearing a lot of that. So AI and generative AI. Let's set the table for everybody, what we mean when we use those terms.
So setting the table, I'll just say that this isn't my definition. This comes from a variety of sources, but the way I think it's important to think about it is that artificial intelligence is basically just the ability of a computer or a computer-controlled robot to perform tasks that we commonly associate with intelligent beings like humans. So there are a lot of arguments about that, like whether it's really intelligence, whether artificial intelligence is really the right word for it. And AI, is sort of a broad term that has lots of different layers underneath it. And that might include things like computer vision, speech recognition, natural language processing, expert systems, all these fancy math kind of tactics and techniques fall under the umbrella of what we call artificial intelligence. When we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about a type of artificial intelligence that's capable not just of what we used to traditionally think of artificial intelligence in terms of predicting, analyzing data, but instead actually generating new data, generating text, images, or other media. And the idea is that generative AI models learn the patterns and structure of data that they're training on, and then generate new data that has similar characteristics to that. So that's kind of like a level set, but I mean, you could write a whole tome on different people's definitions of these things, but I think that's a good one.
So this year, it became a big part of the public consciousness, but artificial intelligence as a technology is not new. And you've been covering this space for quite some time. When you heard about the debut of ChatGPT earlier this year, which is really the moment that brought this topic into the public consciousness and pop culture, did you feel as a journalist that this was a big moment for this, or did you feel like this was hype and maybe a moment that brought it into public consciousness, but you had seen this industry, you've seen this trend before? I'm curious how you observed the announcement of that and all of the news that we've heard really since the beginning of the year on the topic.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I have been covering artificial intelligence AI for a long time, probably for about almost 10 years, I would say. AI has certainly been in the world since the 1950s. But after 2012, I would say, it really became part of a lot of businesses have been using artificial intelligence techniques kind of behind the scenes, under the hood, in many applications that we use in our daily lives, in Google Maps, for example, in Amazon recommendations, in your car. So there's lots of ways that artificial intelligence has been incorporated in the past. But as I said, those traditional techniques usually were used for some very, like, not very exciting things like predicting, data, um, analyzing a lot of different types of data to come up with some recommendation, but nothing that the public would probably really find super interesting. I will say that generative AI, the term, actually showed up in my inbox a couple of months before ChatGPT. Probably around September, I've determined that I saw the first email that used the word generative AI. But even before that, in April 2022, OpenAI released DALL-E-2, which was their image generator. That generated a tremendous amount of interest. That was really one of the first times that the public got a look at these image generators that were so cool, and you could generate these really neat images. But still, as you say, it wasn't in this mass public consciousness in the way that ChatGPT became. And I have to say that when ChatGPT launched, this was on November 30th, 2022, I didn't think that much of it because there had already been a few similar large language models that had come out. I didn't really see this as that different. I did play around with the original ChatGPT and thought it was fun, but I didn't get that the interface of it was the change maker. So the way it was just a screen with kind of a search bar that anyone could recognize and put a prompt in and ask a question and get an answer, that was something that most people hadn't seen before. And the idea that anyone could try it out just sent it exploding. And it was really just within a couple of weeks after that that it just felt like a complete game changer. And I felt a little silly that I hadn't fully recognized that. And it's really just been a roller coaster since then.
So you've been covering this industry for a long time. Who are the major, let's call them the characters or the players in this story? I feel like we're only hearing about OpenAI because they have developed this interface, and then a couple of the really large tech names have talked about how they're trying to integrate this into their technology, whether it's Google with their Bing search or Apple's been making noise about it. But yeah, again, you've been covering this for some time. Who are the real players who are making things happen in this industry that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating narrative, and there are so many different characters. Certainly, OpenAI is one of the biggest characters. They are the company that um, developed ChatGPT and also partnered with Microsoft to help develop Microsoft's technology, their Copilot, that's now being integrated into all of their Microsoft products. So that's also a way that it's coming to the world as well. But OpenAI had already been in existence for 7 years already. They were founded in 2015 and have had a very sort of strange trajectory. They were actually co-founded by Elon Musk, who's no longer a part of it. And Today, it's helmed by Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And because of ChatGPT, and also because they were so early to this game as far as working with large language models, they've risen to be kind of one of the main leaders in this space. And by leader, I mean a company that has developed these large language models that technology tools like ChatGPT are based on. So ChatGPT is not a model, it's the interface, it's the way you're working with it. The underlying model is GPT-4, and a large language model is basically an AI model, a generative AI model that includes millions, billions, many billions of pieces of text within it that the model is trained on. And that's what allows the model to the word is not understand. It's not understanding anything. It's still just a fancy math program. But basically, it can predict what the most likely next word or even part of the word that would come next in a sentence. And it looks so natural when you prompt ChatGPT to answer you, to the point that you might think it's understanding you, but it isn't. It's the large language model underneath it with vast tomes of data training it that allows it to do its thing. So OpenAI is one of the biggest large language model companies, but there are other players in that space now. The other big one from a startup standpoint is Anthropic. Anthropic, uh, you know, rocketed in, I think, in 2022. I think they just founded at the end of 2021, and they are, have billions of dollars in funding. They have their own large language model called Claude, and it has its own chatbot, and it's trained on its own model. And that's also, a big player in the space. There are a couple of other big startup labs. One is called AI21 Labs, one is called Cohere. But basically, all of these companies are working with the big tech companies that we all know about: Google, Microsoft, Amazon. And so big tech is also the big player in this story. Why? They're the big player because, first of all, when it comes to a company like Google, Google was actually the one that their researchers invented the frameworks and technology that allowed these large language models to be built in the first place. There was a very famous research paper called Transformers that basically is the technology that underpins all of these large language models right now, including GPT-4, which powers ChatGPT, Claude, Poe, Pi, many others. So Google was a big early player here as well. But Microsoft famously partnered with OpenAI, so they're a huge player. Amazon has partnered with Anthropic, with Cohere and others, so they too are a big player. Meta is also a big player in the space, kind of in a different way. They have their own models too. The difference there is that they are famously known for being open with their research. So their models are allowed to be used by other researchers. Some of them are allowed to be used commercially, freely, open to anyone to try, whereas OpenAI's models are closed. You can't just use them without connecting to them through an API. So Meta sort of has a completely different take on this, and their model called Llama, like the animal, the llama, was another one of the big stories of the year when it comes to AI, because that model sort of led the way to a bunch of other open source, open research models that many companies are using, and probably many in your audience might, be trying. Some of them are small, some of them are large, but all of them people say will have a big impact. So I'd say those are kind of the big company players at stake. When you hear about the leaders in the space, the big tech players that have a lot of influence on policy and regulation, for example, these are the folks that we're talking about.
We are going to get to policy and regulation in a moment because it might be the most complex part of the story. But I got the impression that earlier this year, as we saw the public start getting more attention and play around with these tools, it seemed to the public eye that some of these tech companies were caught flat footed, that they didn't understand the implication of this technology. For example, Google on their search engine and what a revenue maker that's been for them. Potentially, companies like Amazon, how it could change the shopping experience. Now, that was the public perception. Do you get the sense that they saw this coming along the way, that they just didn't see the advance would be so quickly, and that's why they reacted and started bringing in more of these resources and announcing big investments? Or were they truly surprised at the leap that this sort of generative AI made in such a short period of time?
I don't think they were surprised. They might have been surprised by the pace of it. It's true that it came so quickly. However, none of them were caught flat footed exactly. I think it's more that at that time, before ChatGPT came out, these big tech companies like Google were pretty reticent to put anything out, as they say, into the wild, for the public to try without being certain of what could happen. But OpenAI kind of had a different take on that. They felt like, well, we need to put this out into the wild for people to try while it's still, not problematic really at a big level. We need feedback. That's actually how people might not know this, but this is really one of the ways that the large language models like GPT-4 are trained. They're not just trained on the initial data, they're also trained on ongoing feedback, and that feedback ideally comes from humans. So the more, strangely, like the more we use them and the more the company that is building the model gets feedback from us or other testers, the better the model will become. And they call that reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF. So that's a big term in the business too. So OpenAI realized that, and they also felt they had an interesting take just culturally and just emotionally in society, that it was important to put it out there to get people used to it in a way, which sort of is exactly what happened. Like, it's been quite disruptive, but it's also in a way gotten people used to the idea of it. So once OpenAI opened those doors, kind of the other big tech companies didn't have a choice but to like go down that path. So immediately you started seeing Microsoft and Google and Amazon and Meta stepping up their game because they didn't really have a choice to, or else the startups were going to kind of eat their lunch. So in a way, it's played out where they've caught up to some extent, really moved forward, also partnering with these companies in many ways. So it's not just their own models. They might be partnering with OpenAI or partnering with Anthropic. Um, and just to say what underlies it all, one of the other big players that I didn't mention is NVIDIA, which is the kind of the shovels to go dig the gold. So you can't do any of this work with ChatGPT, with GPT-4, with large language models without computing power. You need lots of power to get the AI to do its thing. And, every one of those prompts takes power. And that power comes from what are called GPU processors. And the vast, vast, vast majority of GPUs that are used for AI models comes from NVIDIA. So if you look at NVIDIA's stock, they're famously known for their AI chips. And if you look at their stock over the past year since ChatGPT came out, it's been soaring as high as the sky. So, NVIDIA is the other big player there from the big tech standpoint.
So when you think about the technology companies were working on this behind the scenes. They are now sort of forced to come out with some variation of what OpenAI launched, get the public used to it. Are we seeing a clear leader in that? Are any of these tech companies clearly further along in either the adoption of this technology, implementing it within their business models? Is anybody falling behind? Or are you seeing the entire industry sort of progressing at a common pace now that the public is more used to the term and engaging with it?
I think it remains to be seen, and it also depends on what sector you're talking about. So OpenAI is clearly the big leader. But there's a lot of privacy and not wanting to show all your cards. So we don't really know what's going on as far as revenue, as far as profits. Like we don't have insight into that. So it's really hard to tell sometimes. You can see these sky high valuations, but you don't really know what's going on. But there's no doubt that OpenAI is has made huge leaps over the past year. So certainly you can say that Microsoft is a beneficiary of that because they've partnered with OpenAI. They have integrated OpenAI's technology across all of their applications. They have enterprises that are basically required to use their cloud services, Azure, in order to get access to GPT-4. So in some ways you can say, well, Microsoft is the big winner. Well, not so fast, because Google, even though you could say they were late to the game, especially when it comes to search, like they've now integrated Bard in their AI model Bard into their search engine. Um, but more so, the truth is that as you know, as exploding as generative AI is, it's not replacing search engines anytime soon. And Google remains, no matter how much Microsoft has tried to get Bing with its integrated generative AI in it to create some traction against Google. That's not the case. Google still has the vast, 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 vast majority of search results, search queries. So, in a way, you can say Google, isn't really behind at all. And they have made a lot of steps to catch up and integrate generative AI into all of their applications, Google Docs, Google Sheets, all of the Gmail, everything. So you could say that they're not, falling behind either. Amazon, some say that Amazon is kind of farther behind in the model sense because their own proprietary models are not as far along as some of the others. So you might say that Amazon is falling behind. But wait, Amazon is really known for partnering with all of the model companies. So Amazon is a big leader in cloud, their AWS system. If you use AWS, you can get access to so many of the big models. You can get Anthropic models, you can get Cohere models, you can get IO21 models. So in a sense, you can say that Amazon is taking, bets on offering just a lot more options, including open source options. They have a big partnership with a platform called Hugging Face, where you can access like hundreds, thousands of AI large language models. So you can say, and then Meta, has really made big strides with its Llama open source model. So in some ways, you can say that Meta is a winner too. So, it all depends on what angle you're looking at.
They're pursuing in different ways. So let's talk about some of what, from your perspective, the practical use cases, right? I think we've heard a lot of the pie in the sky, going to replace every job in 10 years, going to upend every element of the economy. And maybe there is some truth to that. But where we are now feels like companies, even governments, militaries for that sake, are all researching the practical use cases. How do we take the technology that's out there today and use it for practical purposes of efficiency and supplementing people in the field? What are you seeing, the companies outside of the tech companies, private companies or public companies? What practical use cases are you hearing about that are actually having real world effects right now?
Well, I think the kind of the lowest hanging fruit of use cases from the start that were, obvious to all of us were anything around content. So, whether that is in marketing or in sales, where you could be, quickly iterating and putting out, much faster than a human could, different, whether it's, social media posts or emails or blog posts even, or any kind of content that a company is creating. That use case is very clear, and certainly, you know lots and lots of studies showing that marketers, advertising companies of all sorts that use content in this way are definitely trying out all sorts of generative AI tools. But that's kind of still pretty limited, and that's not the big wins that most any Fortune 500 company would be looking for. Pretty immediately after ChatGPT came out, I spoke to people in big consulting firms and such, and they said that the big thing that companies want ultimately is to be able to, they call it knowledge discovery. If you think of a Fortune 500 company, there are mountains and mountains of pieces of data of all sorts that are unstructured, that are in little silos that you can't find, you really can't analyze. If you could have generative AI kind of organize that for you, summarize for you, find it for you, search for it for you, do things with it for you, this is the big win. This would, massively affect productivity across all sorts of other departments, whether it's legal or HR or finance or operations or supply chain or whatever. Um, but that hasn't, that takes a long time. I've been covering enterprise technology for many years, and I know that, when it comes to any new technology, these are slow moving things that has lots of different parts. There's a lot of infrastructure that has to be kept in mind. There's all sorts of cultural issues and people issues that come into play. And there's also a lot of experimenting that you have to do because, we didn't get into this, but we've all heard about the problems with these large language models and the chatbots. There's issues around what they call hallucinations. Like, is the accuracy there? Not always, sometimes, depends on what you're using it for. There are issues around disinformation, like it could be spreading things that aren't true. We don't want that, especially in a consumer facing application. There's issues with security and privacy. Are you sharing data that isn't appropriate? So there's all kinds of things that, a big company, not someone like you and me trying out ChatGPT, that's fine. But a big company has a lot to work on to figure that out in ways that work for them. That's, A, actually works, B, shows a return on investment. So it's interesting. I've spoken to lots of companies over the past few months where I do feel a little bit of a shift lately where, CEOs and boards, they're really pressuring their companies to, we need to not miss out. We have FOMO. We don't want to miss out on generative AI. But now they're also realizing, like, well, this is going to take some time to get return on investment. So even the biggest companies, especially in higher regulated industries like financial services or healthcare, I spoke to the CIO of Goldman Sachs recently, and I was surprised to hear, I mean, financial services really is a highly regulated industry. They have to be super careful, but Goldman Sachs is still experimenting. They have no use cases of generative AI in actual production, meaning that it's, actually in an application that people are using publicly. They're all experimentation use cases in things like marketing or code development, things like that. So, I think it's a slow moving experience for most companies, and that's been true about most technologies for them. So that kind of pokes into the hype a little bit. And, I think that, companies in the AI space that are selling to them, selling products to them, have to really show the value. Like, the word value is coming up a lot more today than it was a few months ago.
And all of this is really fundamentally built on data and the access that the models are going to have to data. So some of the use cases you just mentioned some of it's proprietary data. These are companies that wouldn't want that information out in the public, but for their narrow use cases within the company, they'd want to query it and organize it. And then as we get into the more public facing tools, now we're getting into the debates about who owns that data to begin with. Do you have the right to access it to educate or to train a large language model or any other form of artificial intelligence? So let's start shifting to that regulation piece of the conversation, because this may very well drive where this technology goes in the future. Again, outsiders' perspective, felt like some governments of the world were not caught up on this, even though, as you said, the general technology has been out there for years, but this advancement and the public use of it is relatively new. From your perspective, which governments are getting it right? They're asking the right questions. They're starting to put out a framework. And then do we have some in the world who are just way behind and they're going to have to start advancing quickly to get any sort of framework in place so this industry can start to figure out where it's even allowed to innovate?
I don't know if I would say that any government is really ahead of the game here by any means. Um, this has become so complicated. But I will say that, many governments were working on AI legislation before generative AI came out and ChatGPT came out. For example, in the EU, the EU AI Act that is currently in its potentially final stages of discussion, um, began its efforts back in 2021. And in the US, there were efforts around developing legislation around AI, especially around things like facial recognition technologies, for the past few years. So it's not that nothing has been done, but certainly generative AI took this whole thing to the next level because, again, we're not just talking about predicting or analyzing, we're talking about generating. And that generation leads to all sorts of concerns that eh, were not here in the same way as they are now. So, issues of copyright, for example, before the content was generated, that issue wasn't as much in the forefront. Issues of security risks were not, there in the same way as they are now. Issues around deep fakes and um, misinformation sort of amped up now to an entirely different level. So I do think that all governments have kind of had to step up their game and really kind of try to move a little more quickly, which is, of course, very difficult for governments generally, and particularly difficult when you're talking about such complex issues that touch almost all parts of society. That's what's interesting to me in particular, is that these issues affect so many different parts of society. They're going to affect the workforce, as far as jobs. It's going to affect a million things related to intellectual property and copyright. It's affecting national security. It's affecting elections. So we're talking so many different issues. So I do feel like there was and there has been an effort to move more quickly, but I can't say that any government is moving terribly quickly. The EU, however, was set up since they had started already in 2021. And also, the EU, because of their previous work on data privacy, which manifested itself with the GDPR legislation that was passed in 2018. They do have a history there. I think I've been told that they just have more of an appetite for regulating these issues than other countries. Um, on the other hand, the US also has states and local governments that are taking action in these areas. So even though the US might be farther behind from a national point of view, they've actually been making some headway on a state level and a local level in many different states, California, New York, Colorado, also in specific industries. That's been in the news this week, that different industries and in different states are kind of focused on narrow regulations for their own areas. So very recently, there was a law passed in Colorado, for example, around the insurance industry's use of AI. So, and in New York City, there was recently uh, a a law passed around the use of AI in hiring tools for employment. So, and then you have completely different ways of approaching this. My understanding is that in Japan, for example, when it comes to the issue of regulating copyright of AI, generative AI images and texts, they're pretty much, going to eliminate copyright. Like there just won't be any regulation. It'll just be free flowing. So that's another way of tackling it. But for all of these folks, it's a real balancing act because, as you say, you're talking about you don't want to restrict innovation completely. I mean, AI has a lot of really exciting practical applications coming down the pike, but you also have to deal with all sorts of current risks around bias and misinformation and impact on society, as well as kind of like longer term risks that people worry about.
When you think about those risks in the context of their order of priority, do you get a sense that regulators have sort of a list? So you mentioned, like in some countries, copyright is going to be less of an issue. I suspect it'll be more of an issue in a country like the US, where so many artists make so much of their living off of their copyrighted material. So that could be cultural. But do you get a sense that regulators are trying to prioritize those regulations? I assume national security would be a top priority, but then beyond that, as you said, workforce, education, healthcare, there isn't any sector that's not touched by it. So, as you've been speaking with regulators and governments and others in this space, or even the companies themselves, are there particular priority areas they want to get the regulation right first, and then they'll move on to some of the others as they progress?
I mean, I don't think it's going to be that possible to to do it as a hierarchy. But for example, in the EU, my understanding is that the whole framework of it is going to be around the uh, level of risk of different technologies. So, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether that should be use case specific or technology specific. Like, so you can hierarchize the technology based on how it's used or how it could be used. But I do understand that the EU AI Act is focused on levels of risk. So they're looking at different technologies and how risky they are, say, obviously the highest risk use case would be around something like national security. Um, a lower risk use case would be something like using it in Microsoft Word, I guess. But also, that risk, there's a lot of discussion around that because, national security is a big risk, but also is something like deepfakes. So in the US, for example, Senator Chuck Schumer, who is the majority leader in the Senate, um, in the spring, he announced that there would be a series of forums for senators to learn and educate themselves about all the different risks and use cases of generative AI and AI generally. And it seemed to be in a bunch of different buckets. So, issues around security was one, copyright was another, impact on civil rights and society was another one, the impact of open source models, as I mentioned, versus ones that are closed. What does that mean? So I think there are these different risk sectors that people are looking at, some of which relate to current risks. I will say that because you do have some loud voices across big tech that are focused on what they call existential risks of AI. And those are kind of the science fiction kind of risks that, you might see in movies, that AI takes over and eliminates humanity. Most researchers don't really see that as a very um, huge risk to worry about right now. Not that you shouldn't research it and look into it, but the current harms of AI or the medium term harms are probably more, important to focus on, especially around national security and the military. But the voices that you hear at the policy table are often uh, big tech folks that have a belief system around more science fiction type risks, and they have pretty loud voices at the table. So, for example, there's a big summit coming up in the beginning of November called the UK Safety Summit. And that's going to be, I believe it's the first big summit that is going to bring together AI leaders around issues of safety and risks. And there's a lot of talk about that, like, well, which risks are we talking about and whose voices will be heard most loudly at that table?
So, as you've gone around and you've asked from tech leaders, folks who in the regulatory space, emerging companies, where do you see for those of us who are not in this every day, do you think are the most practical risks that a business owner needs to be mindful of if they want to implement this sort of technology, or even if you're a local government or something, you need to start thinking about this for the everyday citizen? I know there's a lot of science fiction risks, but maybe the more practical and everyday risks that you, even as a journalist, look at and you're asking more questions about and you want to learn more about.
I mean, I think one thing is that you have to, keep an eye on what regulation is coming down the pike. So if you're in New York City, you're starting to have to look at if you're using AI tools for hiring, they now need to be audited by a third party and you need to be on board with that. So you can't just, hide away and not be aware of what issues people are talking about as far as regulation and governance of AI that you use, even if it's a third party tool that you bought, from a vendor. That vendor would need to help audit that tool with you. But some of the immediate risks I think would be, very recognizable to any business owner. Like one is liability. Like, am I going to be liable if I use um, ChatGPT in my company and it says something really bad that impacted someone on social media, or if I used a tool, an AI tool in my retail system, or if I was using imagery that was using an AI image generator like DALL-E or Midjourney, and I was using copyrighted material, like, am I liable for that? Do I own that? What if my advertising agency owns that? What are the ethics of that? And a lot of these issues don't exactly have resolutions quite yet. For example, when it comes to using image generators, there are companies like if you use Adobe in your company and you're in their enterprise program, they will cover your liability, and that's true for some other companies like Google and Microsoft. Um, but that might not apply if you're a small business. So if you're just starting out or you're a founder, you just do have to think about those things. Um, I think issues with your workforce, are like, what are your employees thinking? What are they using? And are they using some of these AI tools? Do you have a policy in place for them to use these tools or not? Are they just using them without your permission? What are they using it for? Are they using it by inputting your company's data into it? ChatGPT is learning from every prompt you put into it. So, do you have a policy? Does it matter to you if your employees are using that? Um, yeah, so I think these are cases that companies might have policies in place for other technologies, but maybe not have moved forward thinking about this particular type of technology. You might, if you have people that work on cybersecurity for you. These are issues that are coming up as far as security risks. Like there are people using AI to hack into your systems. So, I feel like there's a real education and awareness that's happening now, that wasn't there before because it didn't have to be. Like, maybe if you were a smaller company and you weren't using AI tools, then you weren't a large company that had its own data scientists or machine learning engineers working on things for you. You didn't really have to concern yourself with this. But I think now, obviously, it's totally different. It's impacting your business, it's going to impact your employees, it's going to impact you personally. So I feel like keeping abreast of issues, having policies in place, but also understanding what the tools are. Like, I feel like, it's one thing for your kids to start using it for homework, but if you haven't tried some of these tools and have an understanding of what they can and can't do, you might find that, like, these aren't useful for my business right now anyway. Do I really need to be using them? Until we know more about how things will play out, legislation wise. How do I feel about it ethically and morally? Yeah, so I feel like, there's a lot of educating coming right now. There's a lot of learning, and it's the development is happening at such a big pace that, it's really impossible to keep up. But if you can pick a couple of, news sites that you trust to read and keep abreast of some of these issues that go beyond maybe what, consumers are reading about, like getting scared about robots coming. Like, if you're interested in it from a business standpoint, there are sources you can read that kind of, focus more on that. And then, just maybe trying these tools out yourself and seeing what you think.
What do you see as the next chapter of this? We just talked about where we've been, kind of where we are. What are you excited about as you look over the next 12 or 18 months? What are the questions that are being asked in this industry that once they get answered, we'll know what the next step is in the implementation, the practical implementation of artificial intelligence in our everyday lives?
Well, I think that, when it comes to generative AI tools, we're going to really continue to see very targeted and focused applications by industry and by task. So, for example, tools for marketers, tools for salespeople, tools for your HR department, tools for legal departments, um, tools for helping, just business owners with all of the things that they need to do every day. So, as opposed to just these like general chatbots or, you know, just very general applications that you might think work for everybody, it's going to get very targeted by task and by industry. So if you are, a factory, making products in this particular industry, there'll be these AI applications for you. If you're a salesperson in a retail company, there'll be these tools for you. So I think that's just going to happen more and more and more. And it's not going to be so much of the big, tools for billions of people, but they'll be for very targeted applications in business. That's one thing. Another big thing that I think is rapidly advancing, though I don't think it's really super short term. It's not something that we're going to see in a very useful way, probably for not another couple of years, but you'll just be hearing more and more about AI agents. So, the autonomous nature of AI, where um, these AI tools and applications can actually do tasks for you with, just a little prompt. So as opposed to just prompting an AI to answer a question, maybe it could, the initial jokey tasks are things like order a pizza for you or, set up your travel itinerary, but, just all sorts of like tasks, bunches of tasks together that an AI agent could go forth and do for you. Just this morning, for example, I mean, this isn't something that will be applicable to the average person, but just as an example, NVIDIA's research teams came out just today with an AI with research that showed they had developed an AI agent that could autonomously train robots to do things. So they were able to train a robot to turn a pen around and do like 30 different tasks in ways that were faster than humans. So this is, obviously a little farther down the pike, but it does show that there is an effort to get AI to do lots of different things that we do in ways that could be helpful to us. But obviously, it also brings up a lot of questions as to what that impact on society will be. And the impact of autonomous AI agents would be even bigger than what we've seen so far with generative AI. So that's food for thought.
When we think about the natural limits that there might be to this, so let's step outside of the regulatory space for a moment and into the practical space. You mentioned a chip maker like NVIDIA and their ability to continue to produce the processing power needed for the ever evolving space. Are there hardware limitations? Are there physical limitations on what these models can do, the power they rely upon, parts of the world where this may be harder to implement? Are there these practical things that companies are going to have to think about as they try to implement the next generation of what you're talking about here, whether it's AI agents or anything else? This all requires computing power. And I'm just curious from your perspective, where is that going to come from? And are there limits to what we can generate?
There's a lot of questions around that, and sometimes it's hard to tell like what is really, we can't really predict what's coming down the pike. I can say that there's lots and lots of efforts to figure out these problems because there are many of them. There's issues related to compute. There's the environmental impact of these models and the compute power that it takes. There are problems with the models themselves, like some people make it sound like these large language models are the end story. They most definitely are not, because large language models require so much data. What happens when you run out of it? Like how if you create new data, well, can you create enough new data? Is there enough data to be created on planet Earth? That can get complicated. So there are people that think that there needs to ultimately be a new type of model that could be more, and I'm saying this quote unquote, intelligent. That could be more accurate, that could be more useful, and intelligent in ways that we, might use metrics as intelligence. Um, I'm not saying it in terms of actual thinking, because it's not thinking in the same way that we think or think about thinking. But yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who, it's hard for me to tell what's pie in the sky. It definitely doesn't seem to be like within the next 10 to 20 years, but you know, different ways of creating computing power. I've spoken to folks that are very invested in researching the idea of analog chips, which is super interesting, like stuff that goes back to analog days and isn't digital. Which
Interesting.
seems strange, but if you could do that, then you would be able to deal with a lot of the electricity
Hmm.
costs of models. And then there's the issue of researching ways to make models smaller, where they don't need so much data and they don't need so many parameters. So a lot of people I speak to talk about that as ways to get more realistic. Like, do you really need such a general big model that can like boil the ocean of human knowledge? Or do you need a smaller model that can do something smaller, tasks that are specific, and maybe could be as small as in your phone or in a little device? There's a lot of talk about that, where it's not just a model that exists in a big data center and you are using it on the web like ChatGPT, but that it becomes almost like your personal model that is trained on your personal data, which of course brings up a million issues. But, these researchers think that's a fun idea, that we should all have our personal AI. So that's something that you might hear more about in the coming year, I think.
And who is writing the rules of the next generation of whether it's regulation or self-regulation? So we sort of know that elected officials are in charge of having those formal rules, but it feels like this industry is trying to do some level of self-regulation. But I can't tell for the life of me who's influencing it, who's lobbying for it, who's getting in a room and writing any of these things. How are you seeing that come together about the voices that are going to be in the room to write the rules upon which future competition in this industry is going to be based?
Well, as far as self-regulation, I mean, I don't know that I could say that there is currently self-regulation. I can say that, there's certainly a lot of people in the industry, even within the big tech companies, that work very diligently on, creating AI responsibly. There are different nonprofit organizations around these issues. A lot of the open source companies, these are the companies working on models that anyone can access. They're very, there are many people working hard on developing these models safely. Certainly, like, you hear a lot from OpenAI about their goals to develop AI safely, but the problem is we can't see under the hood of what they're doing, so we're just taking them at their word. That seems, not that smart. So I don't know about that, but as far as who has a seat at the table, I think that's what's happening right now. Is there's a lot of voices being raised about who needs to be at that table. For example, at the first forum that Senator Schumer did hold with senators, the 15 people that were invited were mostly big tech CEOs, probably like 8 or 9 of them. And there was a lot of brouhaha about, hello, why aren't, more diverse voices at this table? And they ended up having, maybe another dozen people from different areas of AI, as far as researchers, ethicists, um, civil rights folks, people from different industries, but it still was behind closed doors, which I understand can be, if these senators are still learning, they might want to do that behind closed doors, but it's problematic. It makes it feel like we don't know what's going on and we don't know who has the biggest voices at the table. So I think there's a lot of efforts right now to make sure that other voices are heard. The voices of creators, for example. You have a lot of artists and creative workers, saying, we want a say in this. There's all the open source people want a voice, all the um, different ethicists and people focused on uh, democracy and AI want a voice in this too. So I think it remains to be seen. I mean, that's part of the challenge.
Do you think that there are critical voices that are not being heard at this point? You mentioned some that weren't even part of this summit, but are there areas that you've been looking at and looking into where you're just not seeing any representation from a specific industry or from a specific specialty?
I mean, I think I was just writing about this morning, but what I find is that, like anything else, you have extreme voices on both sides that often are the loudest, and you have the pragmatists, this big majority in between that kind of get drowned out. So, for example, you have I call them, well, they call themselves more the utopians, the techno optimists. Just this week, like, one of the biggest venture capitalists, Mark Andreessen, came out with a really kind of libertarian style blog post about the future of AI and techno optimism. And he's one of the loudest voices at the table. So, and so are his peers. So, that extreme voice that, like, almost like there shouldn't be any regulation, we should just be free, technology will free us all kind of value proposition. And then you have what, has been called the AI doomer side, the people who think that AI is going to destroy humanity. You've had recently some very respected voices in AI sort of turn into that side of the coin, you have, he's called the godfather of AI. Jeffrey Hinton appeared on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago. I mean, this is a man who kind of helped revolutionize uh, AI into what it is now. And has basically said that he changes his tune and he thinks it's very, very dangerous. Um, and that voice is very loud. But, I have a lot of folks that I speak to that kind of are frustrated by that the vast middle ground of what you might call pragmatists, people who are focused on policy and current risks and not stifling innovation, but dealing with it from a lot of different pragmatic perspectives, are not being heard as loudly. So I think that's the fear, that both ends of these extremes are kind of getting the biggest voice at the table, and some of the less loud voices, or the voices with less power. There's a lot of politics. It's really turned into a political power play now, which has been super interesting, but also very strange to see that, but I guess obviously, the big tech voices are kind of like capturing that political power, and much smaller voices, unions, creative workers, civil rights activists. These aren't the well-funded lobbyists that big tech has, so that's an issue as well.
Are you seeing a breakdown political lines, and this can be domestically in the U.S. or internationally? Is there sort of a common one side of the aisle is more in favor of tech companies and their ideas, and the other is not, or are you seeing that there's a general skepticism and tech is trying to shape that conversation?
It's really interesting. I feel like AI regulation is one of the few really bipartisan efforts that's been going on. For example, in the Senate, Senator Schumer's forums are helmed by four senators, two Democrat and two Republican. And in the House, I'm sorry, this is also the Senate, another area of the Senate in I think it's the Judicial Committee, I might be wrong, but Senator Blumenthal, who is Democrat, and Senator Hawley, who is Republican, have really aligned on their efforts in hearings. So it's really quite a bipartisan effort when it comes to AI regulation. But on the other hand, it's so strange. It kind of like bleeds into different, like there are some elements of it that you can see are kind of real Republican talking points, but others that are Democratic, and it doesn't always align in this neat way that you might expect. It comes out a little messy. So I actually really hope that it stays bipartisan, because the last thing we need at election time is to start thinking that these issues are red or blue, because they're not.
So as we come to the end of the hour, I always want to know from a journalist what questions you're asking, because they're the questions that we should be asking. So with the folks that you're reaching out to and the stories that you're working on, what are the big questions that you want answered? Let's just say for the rest of this year, 2023, and as you're looking ahead to 24, what's on your mind?
Well, I'm asking large companies for sure what they are doing and where they're at, because, they're the ones that are kind of really experimenting at a big, high level with a lot of these tools for their companies. So, how are their experiments going? What are they putting into production? How are they hiring? How are they dealing with their employees? How are they reskilling? How are they thinking of this from like a larger regulatory perspective? Like, what are they thinking is coming down the pike? How are they trying to impact the policy voices out there? So when I speak to someone like the CIO of Goldman Sachs, like, I wish I could stay on the phone with him for, a couple of hours and pick his brain there. I'm also super interested in, obviously the regulatory issues that are coming down the pike. The EU AI Act is going through this process called a trilogue. And everyone I talk to says that they're really trying to pass something by the end of the year. And I'm really curious as if that's really going to happen. So that's something I'm tracking. I'm covering a lot of stuff around the open source space. So I'm speaking to a lot of people about, because this applies to enterprise businesses as well who are trying these models. I'm asking a lot of questions on all sides of the debate. How people think open source AI is going to impact the industry over the next year. Um, I'm certainly very, very interested in how these issues are going to impact the workforce. So I'm covering a lot of the lawsuits that are happening. I'm really curious as to how companies are going to deal with headcount. Like, are they really not going to fire people for AI, or is there talk behind the scenes? Is that really their end goal? Am I just being, negative, cynical? But there are so many interesting issues at play. It's kind of this swirling landscape that I find really exciting. I think there's a lot to be excited about. I also do feel like there's a lot of really exciting applications for AI, especially in areas like healthcare. I've spoken to a lot of folks about super interesting things about using AI to develop new vaccines and new drugs and things like that make you feel like AI is not all bad. Uh, so I think it's going to be a really exciting year ahead.
Excellent. There's so many topics in that if we do get some advancements in any of those, we might have to have you back and do this again and get the latest information as you've gotten some answers from those. It's been very nice to speak with you for the hour. I know our audience deeply appreciates it. If folks would like to read some of your work and learn more about you, where is the best place for them to do that?
So they can find my work on VentureBeat, which is at venturebeat.com. And if you just search my name, Sharon Goldman, VentureBeat, you'll find me. I'm on all the socials as well if you want to follow me there.
Excellent. And we'll include those in the description of this podcast as well, and on all of our social media and web assets as well. Sharon Goldman, thank you very much for taking time to join us today.
Thanks so much, Brian.
You never understand an issue or a topic quite as well as you do after speaking with a journalist, somebody who's covering this and has for an extended period of time, long before we were all paying attention to it. I think that interview, and I tell you all the time to listen to these shows more than once, but this is one in particular where you may want to go back and listen to this 3 or 4 times, or at least some of the pieces of the show, to go back and listen to it again and again to really absorb the history of this technology, the practicality of where we are with it today, and all of the issues that governments around the world have to wrestle with and that the business communities themselves have to wrestle with. Um, my my personal view on the United States angle of this, and so much of my audience is global and is international, but I have a decent following in the U.S. So I do want to, and that's where I'm based. I do want to take a second to talk about the U.S. For those who are less familiar with the United States in general, it is a people and a culture that is entrepreneurial by nature and that is more willing to take risks and is more averse to government regulation. So it's not surprising to me that the US is lagging behind the Europeans and other parts of the world in putting out a regulatory framework for the advent of artificial intelligence as a whole, generative AI as a extension of that, machine learning and other related technologies and tools and their applications in the world. But what's interesting to me is this is the first time I can remember an industry reaching out to government and saying, you need to regulate us. I can't remember any industry of any kind going back as far as American history can go. You never heard the oil barons say, we need regulation, or the railroad operators, or the coal miners, or even in modern times, Wall Street and business titans of Silicon Valley. You never heard anybody come out and say, you need to regulate us. And I think that's eye opening for all of us. So I asked Sharon what questions that she has as a journalist, and she gave us some really important insights at the end of that interview as to the stories she's going to be following and some of the questions that she's going to be asking in the months to come. But if I have one lingering question out there, it is, what do these current leaders in the AI space know that makes them so concerned that they would be willing to forego some of the early mover advantages that come with a deregulated or unregulated space and proactively call for some early form of a rules of the road so that they know where to operate within? There have to be dangers to this that we don't fully appreciate, but that the business leaders, the entrepreneurs, and the practitioners of this can see coming down the road. And that gives me some concern. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. The United States is full of entrepreneurial business titans who love a deregulated space or an unregulated space. And they're not all nefarious actors. They just love the freedom that comes with going out and testing and learning and competing and seeing what happens. And so to see an industry with as much promise as this one come out almost with a fear that if you don't give us some regulations, somebody in this space is going to go out and create something that could harm all of us, that's pretty eye opening. And so that's a question that I'm going to be pursuing on this program and even in my own private affairs, as to getting to the bottom of, not, as Sharon said, the science fiction of stuff that could happen, but what are some of the practical concerns that these leaders have that makes them so open to a conversation with the government? And I will also ask, and we covered it in the program a little bit, who are the right people to have at the table when it comes time to write the rules for AI? We can all agree that when some of the early rules were written around our entire economy in the world, that there were a lot of groups that were unrepresented. And certainly, as the internet became the dominant form of e-commerce, well, as e-commerce became a thing, there really wasn't a whole lot of consumer representation at that table. And it took some time for government to catch up. And this is going to be a space where every element of our economy is touched by the rollout of these tools and technologies. And it seems like the companies are already taking it very slowly and very carefully, but that's some of them. And mostly those in a highly regulated space. But those who are not in a highly regulated space, they're probably not going to be apt to take such a conservative approach, and they're more willing to take more risks. And I think it's important for us to ask all those questions about the nature of those risks and what it could mean for all of us. This is an incredibly important topic, and I look forward to speaking with more journalists and more industry leaders on it. And it's been a popular topic on the program. So if you wonder why we keep coming back to it, it's because it's the trend of the year of 2023. And it also seems to be of great interest to my audience, both in the US and around the world. So we will keep up on it. We have a lot more great episodes to come. And certainly this is going to continue to be a theme of those, AI. But we're also going to be coming back to some topics that we've covered in previous episodes, and I'll be giving you some of my thoughts and reflections on those. So stay tuned for those episodes still to come. And look, at this point, we've put out so many programs, you can binge the whole thing. If this is the first time you're hearing the show, and maybe this topic is what brought you here, please hit that subscribe button on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Google Podcasts, Amazon Music. We're on iHeartRadio, we're on the Odyssey app, and we're pretty much anywhere that you can get your podcasts. And if all else fails or you don't have any of those applications, you can always visit my website, brianjmatos.com. You can find a link to all of our shows, current and past. You can also find me on any of your favorite social media channels, and find me on YouTube, where you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search Brian J. Matos. You'll find me in all of my clips from recent episodes, including this one. And you can subscribe there to get the latest clips from the program so that you don't miss any of our important guests and some of the most important things they have to say. And of course, please share this with your friends, share this with your community. It is a community of curious minds. And so, how can we be a community if we don't grow and share? I encourage you to do so. And we have great episodes still to come. So, stick with us, subscribe, visit the website, keep up with me on social media. And in the meantime, as you go about your daily activities in your daily life, I invite you and encourage you to stay curious.